So guys, it's mid-February and it's time to start seeds. At least that's what I do mid-February, because I want to get a jump start on the garden for next year. And a lot of people make some critical mistakes when they're starting their seeds. I'm going to put in this video 5 of the most critical mistakes you can make. Now, in addition to that, I've got a Patreon where you can go to, and I've got over 50 very common mistakes people make when they're starting seeds. And that should help you quite a bit if you're planning on doing a garden this year and you're planning on starting your own seeds rather than buying from your big box store. So take a look at that if you want a more extensive list. But in this video, I'm just going to cover the 5 most common mistakes, what I call fatal mistakes when starting seeds. You'll have a problem. Well, one of the most common problems you have is you have damping off, and I'll put a photograph of that right here so you can get an idea of what that looks like if you've never started seeds before. If you have, you've probably seen this happen many times. So I'm going to give you those 5 critical mistakes people are making when they start seeds. Now, overwatering is the most common thing people do. They think that if the soil isn't properly watered, that the seeds are just not going to sprout. It's usually the opposite of that. It's usually overwatering waterlogs the soil and causes a lot of problems. And I'll go through each one that I know about. But in a tray like this, what you might want to do is consider watering from the side and putting the water in water from beneath rather than just watering from above, because then it's kind of hard to tell how much water they're getting. You can also use a moisture meter. I'll put a link in the description to one of those as well. But making sure the soil is not waterlogged is critical. So make sure that a lot of times in these pre-done trays, they put a little slit at the bottom, and we want to make sure that each one has one, because if you're getting water in there and it's not draining back out, or if it's not a big enough hole, then you can have a waterlogging issue with your seed. So just remember that you want to make sure that there's a big enough hole in the bottom of each cell, and make sure that you don't overwater. I always recommend watering from beneath rather than from watering above. Some people just come in with a hose pipe and water their seeds in their greenhouse if they have one, and it just totally saturates every single cell. So I'd recommend not doing that, but just giving a gentle watering from beneath. Just take your watering can and just water from the side there, and put about a 1/4 inch of water in there, and then check after about 24 to 48 hours and see if the soils have absorbed it, and then keep a close eye on how dry the soils get. A lot of times people are just terrified that their soils are going to dry out and all their seeds are going to die, but that's usually not the problem. As I said earlier, it's usually the complete opposite of that. It's waterlogging. Now, I want to give a brief explanation of why that happens as well. A lot of times this waterlogging event, the reason it happens is your seeds need a certain amount of oxygen in the soil. So if your soils are heavily compacted, or if the water just doesn't evaporate and you're putting too much water on them all the time, then that's what's going to happen, is you're not going to have any oxygen in the soil, and that's what seeds really need. They need oxygen as well as H2O, so you have a double-edged sword there. You have to kind of do a balancing act to make sure you have just the right amount of both. Now, I'm sure that most people are starting their seeds in these type of trays, and waterlogging, or putting too much water there, is the perfect environment for pathogens. And so once the pathogens start, they spread from cell to cell very quickly, and it's the perfect environment for water molds and other things that can happen that will cause something to grow within the seed cells, and that will quickly cause the dampening off issue. So just make sure that you keep a close eye on your watering. It's in the bonsai world, watering is one of the most critical things that we do. We want to make sure that we give the plant just the right amount of water. So losing something like a 25 or 30-year-old tree is very disappointing, and it's very hard to explain. And so a lot of times you have the same principle. This is just on a much smaller scale. Now, those pathogens usually cause something to happen that happens very rapidly. One day you'll come out, look at your new seedlings that have sprouted, and the next day everything will be laying over and dead in that dampening off process. So just remember that you want to make sure that you're following that guideline perfectly, and make sure you get one of those moisture meters, because it can tell you very quickly what the top 1/4 inch, the top 1/2 inch of soil looks like, whether it's too wet or too saturated. Another way to describe it is once the seeds are sitting in this stew of water constantly, they actually rot from the inside. So your seeds actually never even sprout. You never even have the chance to get to the dampening off stage, because the seeds rot and they don't even sprout. Now, this has happened to me before, and I never could really figure out why it happens, but the seedlings fall over once they start growing 1, 2, 3 inches. They'll become very thin right at the soil line, and that's a very good indicator. You'll see that almost like a thread-like thinness, and the top portion of your seedling will be much thicker, but right at the soil line, it will kind of thin out. So that's another sign that you're putting way too much water on your seedling. So just remember, I can't make the point too many times, because that is one of the most critical. I'm saying this is the #1 mistake people make when they're starting their seeds. Now, if this does happen, there's a couple of things you can look for that, or you can at least detect pretty easily. One is kind of a sour smell, kind of an algae-like smell. And another thing is, often if you're exposed to the outdoor or you haven't sterilized your soil properly, you'll see fungus gnats around the area, because they really like it when there's a lot of moisture in the soil, and that really helps them to thrive quite a bit. So fungus gnats and that odor of sourness kind of tells you that you're definitely overwatering. Now, you want your soil to be very light and airy to prevent this from happening. You want it to almost have the feel, if you were to put it in your hand, it's going to feel like a wrung out kitchen sponge. So it's going to be damp but not dripping with water. So I would absolutely recommend getting a good seed starting mix to put in each cell, and you can really make it work better with proper drainage, and it won't be holding too much water. So that's really important as well. Now, once your seeds have sprouted, you want to kind of aim for a wet, dry cycle. You want the top of the soil to kind of have a little bit of a dry appearance, and you can take a Q-tip and put it just below if you don't have a moisture meter, and if you have a lot of material sticking to it, you can kind of tell there's a lot of moisture down below the surface, but you don't want it to look completely saturated on the top. So just make sure that you keep it in that wet, dry cycle, and that's going to help a lot more, because in nature you don't have constant rain, and these seeds could not sprout in your garden naturally, or in the wild for that matter, constantly being wet. So in nature you do have a drying cycle and a moisture cycle going back and forth. So let's move on to #2. The second big mistake most people make is there's a critical stage of the seed where the embryo is starting to break open and is starting to germinate and it's about to send out its roots. Letting the soil dry out at that stage can be a critical mistake, because the seed will not move on to putting out roots if it senses or if the soil is too dry. So just remember that second stage, the initial stage, is really important. The second stage is you can let the soil dry out a little bit, but initially, to get the seed to open up and start sending out roots, you need to make sure you have a nice bit of moisture on there, but again, not waterlogged. Now, this is especially true of really small seeds like lettuce and really tiny type of seeds that you're starting. If you're starting a seed that's very large, like a pumpkin seed or something like that, it's not quite as critical, but those small seeds need consistent moisture to avoid that stage of failing to send out its roots in that germination stage. So just remember, if you are trying to grow something in your cells and the seeds are really small, that's when you may want to focus a little bit more on consistent moisture until you see some evidence of it sprouting. I'll give you a couple of things to look for in this stage that will let you know that the seed did not receive enough water. A lot of times you'll see a certain amount of them sprouting, but then you have other areas or other cells that have nothing. So that could be a sign that you did not provide enough initial water. One thing that you need to carefully look for is if your greenhouse or wherever you had the soil, if you see kind of a crusted area on top, and sometimes you can just rub your finger across it, if it's created a very, very thin, maybe 1 millimeter, 2 millimeters thin of crust, the water can actually run off the side if you're watering from above. So that's another reason to water from below, to make sure that that doesn't happen. But again, I tend to misspray my seeds when I'm starting them to make sure there's no problems. But I also kind of dab around the top, maybe with a chopstick, and make sure a crust hasn't formed, and make sure the seed is actually getting the proper amount of moisture from above and below. Now, there's a couple of reasons that happens with your seeds, and one can be heat mats. If you're using heat mats on your seeds, if you're trying to keep the temperature up, that's always a good idea to do that. But just remember, that can dry the soil out even quicker, and that could be a problem. Also, if your area, wherever you're starting your seeds, is extremely dry, there's not a lot of humidity, that can be another issue. So just remember, you need to be monitoring these twice a day, each day when you're starting your seeds. Once you see them come out and you see some growth happening, then you can kind of ease off your monitoring. But just remember, until you see growth on the top, make sure that you monitor twice a day. Now, as I mentioned, you can see there are some actual humidity domes. Almost all of these seed starting kits come with a humidity dome. You need to make sure you put that on there in the initial stages to make sure humidity is high. Another thing that sometimes these seed starting kits come with is the little soil pellets, and they've been wrapped in something that looks like some type of very thin netting. I don't like those. I think they dry out prematurely. So just remember, get you some really quality seed starting mix and then put it in each one, and you might actually pre-wet it before you put it in there and just wring it out so you'll know there's enough moisture all the way from the top of the cell to the very bottom. Now, number 3, or the third most common reason for failure in seed starting, is improper lighting. And so once the seed breaks the surface, or once the seedling breaks the surface from the seed, it switches into another type of mode. You were in sprouting or germination phase, but now you're in the stage of searching for light or trying to maximize the amount of light. A lot of times the seedling will suddenly start growing much faster and taller if it's not getting the proper amount of light. So just remember that you have to take that into account. You can use, a lot of people don't realize this, but they think they need the really high dollar, expensive lighting that is sold specifically for seed starting, but you can use just ordinary shop lights. You'll just want to create a chain that hangs down close enough so when it breaks the surface, it doesn't have to shoot itself up and thin itself out. So a lot of times you can have that, what almost looks like damping off, even if it's not damping off. It's shot up too quickly and it just falls over because it comes out so leggy and it's so tall. So remember, get the light as close as you can to the seed tray when it first breaks the surface. Now, another thing can happen a lot of times with your seedlings, if it's not given the proper amount of light, is it's putting so much energy into growth, it's not putting as much energy as it should into the roots. So just remember, the lighting needs to be just right for your seedlings, because it can just completely put too much energy in the wrong area of the plant. So just remember, even if it survives, you may have a problem because the roots may be stunted growth because of the lack of light. So lighting is really critical when it comes to starting seedlings. So if you're trying to grow these without the proper type of grow light and you're just setting them in a windowsill, then you're going to have strong growth growing towards the sunlight that's coming through the window. And a lot of times that can be a problem. You'll need to flip your tray around maybe once a day to make sure they're not growing at an angle that may be a problem. So that's going to add an extra layer of work. So I always recommend getting at least a shop light and just hanging it as close as you can when they first emerge. Another thing that happens is if they become too leggy and it looks like they're really stringy, they can't support their first true leaves. So you may have success up until a point, and then suddenly they just fall over because the stem cannot support the first set of true leaves that come out. Now, you want to make sure that you're providing proper lighting from day one, and a lot of times the old-fashioned fluorescents put off a little bit of heat, and that can cause a little bit of heat stress. But of the new LED lights, whether you're talking about a shop light or a grow light, and sometimes those are actually the same thing. Sometimes those grow lights are really overpriced, and they're really not worth it when you can just go with a very inexpensive shop light. I'll put a link in the description to some ordinary shop lights. They're not expensive. I've got 2 new ones here in the greenhouse and also in another shed, and they did not cost a lot of money. So the new shop lights they're coming out with are being mass produced, and they're not specifically geared towards being called grow lights. Once you attach the word grow light to a listing online, you're going to pay a lot more, and a lot of times it puts out the same amount of light properly, so you don't really have to worry about it not getting enough light. Now, another thing you need to do is you need to put the lights that you're using on a timer. You need at least 12 to 16 hours a day initially when they're first coming out. So that seems like a lot of time to be running the light, but a lot of times these LEDs use very little power. So just remember, get a timer in addition to your shop lights or grow lights, whatever you already have, and just make sure that you put it on a timer a minimum of 12 hours until your plants have become strong enough to survive outdoors. I always run my grow lights for quite a while because I want to make sure that the plants were going to do well once I start slowly transitioning them to the outdoors. So let's move on to number 4, the fourth biggest, most critical mistake people make when they're starting seeds. A lot of times they don't have the right temperature. Seeds will often rot, they won't grow properly, they'll actually grow out and then fall over because of dampening as well. The soil will not be the right temperature. So remember, soil temperature is critical, and that's where a heat mat comes in. Having a really good set of heat mats, depending on how many trays you're starting, I would put one of these heat mats, and they don't use a lot of power. I'll put a link in the description to these as well. But I've had these for years and years, and I use them year after year. I'd say these heat mats are at least 10 years old, and I use them every season when I'm starting my seeds, and it makes a huge difference because the seeds will not work properly. I had a friend that actually used to start things on top of his hot water heater because it provided just a little bit of gentle heat. So of course there's not enough room on top of a hot water heater, but he only did a few plants at a time. So making sure that the gentle heat from below is really critical. So germination depends heavily on soil temperature, and if it's not the right temperature, if it's too cold, the risk of rot skyrockets. So just remember that these heat mats will save you a lot of heartache in the long term. It may seem like something you just don't really have to worry about. Maybe you're starting them indoors, but even indoors where you have heating and cooling systems working, a lot of times the trays can still not be the proper temperature. So that's why I just absolutely recommend heat mats and monitor the temperature. You can get a temperature probe as well as the moisture probe, and a lot of times they'll do temperature, light, and heat. Now warm season vegetables really do require consistent heat from beneath. So if you set these on like a basement floor and you don't have them high enough on, like, let's say a shelf, sometimes that can be the issue. Even with heat mats, if it's too low of an area inside the area of the room you're at and that temperature is a little bit lower down below, that can make a difference as well. So one thing I would recommend is getting heat mats that have temperature control. Once your seeds have sprouted, then you can turn it down maybe to a lower setting, but just remember that heat is critical in the beginning and then not so much once you see sprouting taking place. Now a friend of mine had started a lot of seeds right in front of a large window and they had all failed, and he couldn't understand because it was inside of the house where he had heating working in the winter time, and there was light coming in, and he would flip the trays around, or planned on flipping the trays around. But there was another problem that was happening, is the window was not a double pane window, it was a single pane, and there was quite a draft coming, and there was some cool air hitting the seedlings, and it just caused total failure in his sprouts once they did sprout. So even if you do set them in a windowsill, the heat mats are really critical. So soil temperature makes a huge difference. Now the fifth huge mistake people make when planting their seeds is they tend to plant their seeds too deep. It's a very common thing. A lot of people will sometimes cover their seeds with too much soil. They'll put them in a certain level, halfway filled in the seed trays or the cells, and then they'll just cover it with a lot of soil. But that is a critical mistake. You want to remember that these seeds only have a limited amount of energy, and if you've planted them too deep, they're going to run out of energy before they're actually even able to sprout. So that's another critical mistake, is knowing how deep to plant them. I'll tell you that in just a second, but I want to give you some more tips on how to prevent doing that and some things to look for. Now when it comes to my smallest seeds that I'm planting, I'll usually just lay them directly on top of the soil and just do a light dusting with my seed starting mix. That way I know they're not too deep, they're not going to run out of energy, and they're not going to die before they even break the soil surface. Now even if your seeds, if they've been planted too deep, and even if they break the surface and become sprouts, a lot of times they'll be rather pale and weak. So you'll know that if you're seeing some extremely pale looking seeds and they look very weak and they've already started to fall over, it could be because you planted them far too deep. Now what's even worse is a lot of times if you planted all your seeds too deep, they can all die underground before that energy that each seed has, the potential it has, completely runs out. All the energy runs out before it breaks the surface. Now there's a general rule of thumb you can use on almost all seeds. Basically you want to plant the seed about 2 to 3 times its thickness. So if it's just a millimeter in size, you only want to go down 2, maybe 3 millimeters. And when you're talking about really small seeds, again, you don't even probably need to go that deep. I would just do like I said earlier, the light dusting of your seed starting mix. So there's another thing you can use, and that is foggers, and that puts out very gentle mist right to the top of the seeds. There's different types of foggers, but these are specifically made for seeds. And now it's a little bit harder to find these. If I can find one online, I'll put it in the link in the description. But the fogger puts just the right amount of moisture to the top of the soil, and those foggers can make a huge difference. And if your seed again is too deep, even the best laid plans of these seeds that you're trying will not work properly because you've buried them too deep. So remember, go by the rule I mentioned earlier, the 2 to 3 times its width or thickness. So as I said at the very beginning of the video, I was only going to cover 5 of the most critical mistakes, the most fatal mistakes people make when they're starting their vegetable seeds. But I've got a PDF that you can download, save it to your device, print it out to a physical form like this on paper, and you can keep this when you're starting your seeds. You can go over it, and there's over 50 different reasons that seeds often fail. You can learn a lot. It took me 25 years of trial and error and discovering certain things that worked and that didn't work. So just remember, you can get a copy of this just by going to the Patreon. Link in the description. Again, guys, I really appreciate you watching. If you have any questions, I hope you'll become a subscriber first. I tend to put those questions to the front of the list. I get many questions every day, and sometimes I can't get to all of them. So if you're a subscriber, I'll definitely make you a priority. Guys, I really appreciate you watching, and have a great day.